Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, I am joined by Will van Derveer, who is the co-author of the new book, Psychedelic Therapy, a revolutionary approach to restoring your mental health and reclaiming your life, which he co-authored with his colleague, Keith Kurlander. And he joined me the other month from his home in Colorado to talk all about the new book, which covers trauma-informed psychedelic therapy, the importance of preparation, structures for facilitation, and then, of course, the necessity of integration afterwards. We had a lengthy and informative conversation all about it and all about the new book. But first, a few of my regular announcements. Not much to share this week other than to remind you that this is an occasionally listener-supported podcast, meaning that if you would like to support this podcast, it's quite easy to stop by my Patreon page at patreon.com/MartinWBall. There's everything from $1 a month up to $100 a month. You can choose what level you are comfortable supporting the podcast at. You can change it anytime. There's no obligation. And as I like to remind you that if you sign up at the $20 a month and above levels, that gets you full access to the Entheogenic Evolution Archive, which is exclusively available over at my Patreon page for paying supporters. And it has hundreds of hours of talks and interviews and materials that are no longer available actively here on the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. So if you want to take a deep dive into the archive, that is the way to do it. And of course, to remind you, if you are looking for integration and reflection on your entheogenic experience from a non-dual and energetic perspective, I'm always available for 30, 60, and 90-minute video calls. I specialize in 5-MeO-DMT, but I'm not limited to that in any way, shape, or form, and invite you to stop by my personal webpage at martinball.net if you would like more information, or just shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com, and we will set up a time to talk about your experience. And that's really all I have in terms of announcements for right now. Of course, there is more already recorded to come out here on the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast, and I am just starting to transition into the mode of recording even more new interviews. I still have, I think, 3 or 4 that have been recorded that are waiting to come out. I've got more lined up on the way, so just very busy and active here on the podcast in its 19th year of publication, bringing you informative, long conversation format talks and interviews on psychedelic topics. And just a reminder, I have been attending to the Entheogenic Evolution YouTube channel, which I neglected for a number of years, but I've been working on organizing that. And so just a reminder that you can also enjoy the Entheogenic Evolution on YouTube, and I am putting things into playlists. So for example, this interview with Will is going to go into the Psychedelic Authors playlist and also the Psychedelic Therapy playlist that I have created on the Entheogenic Evolution YouTube channel. Anyway, so many different ways you can enjoy the podcast and support the podcast and be supported in return. Well, let's go ahead and get into our conversation with Will. And just a reminder, the book is Psychedelic Therapy, and let's learn all about it here on the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast. Well, I'm excited to welcome onto the Entheogenic Evolution Podcast today, Will van Derveer, who is a psychiatrist and psychotherapist in Colorado. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and you are a co-author with your colleague, Keith. Oh, I wrote down his name, but I can't read my writing.
Oh, Keith Kurlander, yes.
Kurlander, sorry.
No worries.
Yeah, and you guys have a new book. We are recording this on Tuesday, February 24th. The copy of the book that I have is the uncorrected manuscript, so I don't know if it's been released yet or if it will be released by the time this interview comes out. So when is the launch of the book?
Yeah, the release date is March 31st, and we just got our corrected copy, so I have one over my shoulder. If listeners are listening on audio, they can't see it right now, but yeah, it's exciting. We're in the final countdown to the book launch. So,
well, great. Well, then this interview probably will be coming out right around then with the launch of the book. So the book, I don't know if I mentioned the title, is Psychedelic Therapy, a revolutionary approach to restoring your mental health and reclaiming your life. Of course, by Will and Keith Kurlander. Now I've got the front page, so I can read that correctly. Yeah. My wife always gives me a hard time about my handwriting. And I'm experiencing that myself right now.
Well, I'm laughing because I have the proverbial doctor's handwriting over here, so I can relate for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Um, let's just start with where are you in Colorado?
Yeah, we're in Boulder, Colorado. I've been out here for 27 years, so half my life, after growing up in Nashville, Tennessee. So happy to
Mm,
be out here.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's a lot less flat.
Yeah, for sure. And you're in the Bay Area, is that right? Or
No, I'm north of there. I'm in Ashland, Oregon.
Ashland, Oregon? Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
So Southern Oregon. We got mountains too. Most
Yeah.
of our mountains aren't quite as big as yours in Colorado, but locally, our two biggest mountains, well, our three biggest, I'll go with three. We've got Mount Shasta, just down in Northern California, which everybody loves Mount Shasta. It's a great mountain. Volcano. We have Mount Ashland here in town with the ski resort is up there. And then we have Mount McLaughlin is our next closest volcano, which is
Okay.
just over the mountains behind me
Wow.
here, which we can't
Cool.
see when we're down in the valley. But if you get up or get out, then you can see Mount McLaughlin. So lots of
Amazing.
volcanoes and lots of
Wow.
lava. Yeah.
Wow. I hear great things about Ashland. Some people say it's a lot like Boulder, so I'd love to come check it out sometime.
Yeah, yeah, you should. It's a nice little town. What I really love about it is that it is a small town and kind of nestled at the foot of the mountains in the Rogue Valley, and the natural scenery here is beautiful. And we have the Shakespeare Festival, and we also have Southern Oregon University, where I formerly taught till I was laid off. And actually, I hear that enrollment, they're really struggling with enrollment ever since COVID, and that the university might even close, which I think would be a terrible loss to the town
Mm,
because it makes us, a little college town. So
right.
it's quite a diverse and cosmopolitan place for being a relatively small town. So
Mm,
I could see the
great.
similarity to Boulder.
Yeah. Yeah. And plus, you have, like Colorado, you have the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative, and presumably you have service centers in Ashland. And is that right? Or did
Yeah,
Ashland? Okay.
yeah, we've even had a few come and go at this point, and actually on my list to get another interview is with a relatively new place that has opened up downtown. So we have a few options for people working with psilocybin here in Ashland, and my understanding is that one of the places that I'm looking to interview, that they claim that they have almost 80% of all the clients in Oregon
Oh,
coming through
wow.
them.
Wow.
Um, so it's been kind of a rocky rollout with it that I think getting in clients and price points it's been challenging for people
Yeah.
because the way that the program is structured, there's a lot of inherent overhead with
Yes.
facilities and people. And so it's something that I wanted to talk to you about, and especially with how things are in Colorado, but maybe jumping ahead a little bit there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've had we could talk about this later, but we've been running a center in Eugene, downtown Eugene, for a few years as a part of our training program. But we could get into that later.
Oh, I'm curious, what program?
Yeah. So in addition to writing this book, for the past several years, we have been running an organization called the Integrative Psychiatry Institute, which trains doctors and nurse practitioners in integrative medicine strategies for mental health, and also psychotherapists for psychedelic therapy. And we opened the psychedelic training program a couple of years before Oregon passed its measure. And so it was a year-long program that covers psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine. We had several hundred people go through that program before Oregon came online, and then we added we applied through OHA to get that training certification, and had about maybe 2,000 people go through the Oregon training program over the last couple of years. So we're very familiar with the challenges in Oregon, and it's unfortunate, but it sort of makes sense that the measure was put together, I guess, on the idea that it would maybe be more passable when they said, okay, we're going to self-fund this from inside of the program rather than having any support from the more general budget in Oregon, is my understanding. So that became a problem in terms of having to raise fees on the practitioners and also the centers and the growers and the certifiers and so on. So it's been tough.
Yeah. Well, wow. I think we've got a lot to talk about today.
Yeah.
Um, so let's go ahead and let's progress into getting into all that. But I'd like to invite you to start with kind of where you start within the book of sort of sharing your own story of not only your practice as a psychotherapist, but then how kind of your eyes were open to the potential of psychedelic therapy and how that changed your outlook as a practicing psychiatrist. So, and this is one of the stories that both you and Keith share your own personal stories kind of periodically through the book. And this is actually where the book starts, is with you.
Well, thanks, Martin. I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Nashville. My parents were in the Methodist Church, and I was interested in spirituality, but what I saw all around me was more hollow ritual without a whole lot of juice in it. And so when I was about 13 or 14, I look back on it and now I call it a church tour, where I was looking for a place to land for my spiritual path as a young teenager. And I never found anything that quite fit at that time. And then toward the end of college, I discovered Buddhism and I started getting interested in meditation. And that led to a trip to India and learning, getting some instruction from people who seemed to know a lot more than I did about meditation. And I sort of had this mindfulness foundation in my life as a young adult, and going through medical school and psychiatry training, I was always a little skeptical about the pharmaceutical only model that I was learning for the most part in my medical training as a psychiatrist. And I learned a very tough lesson as soon as I graduated from psychiatry training, that when I started my practice, I found out that talk therapy and medication management didn't do much for a lot of the people I worked with. And so I got very discouraged and actually quit psychiatry right after I graduated my residency, and went on a walkabout for a bit, and then came to find out that there actually is a connection between the gut and the brain, and hormones matter in mental health, and inflammation is a problem from all the different inputs that in our culture, modern culture, is a problem. And this all was prior to anything having to do with psychedelics. But I was learning. I came back to psychiatry and I was applying some of these integrative medicine strategies, functional medicine strategies in my practice, and I was getting some traction with some people. But I was still struggling to help people with complex trauma, and especially early trauma from childhood. And that's when I got invited to participate in a MDMA clinical trial that was being organized by MAPS at the time. This is about 2011, 2012. And I was very skeptical about MDMA. I was kind of in the brainwashed generation of young doctors, and I thought it would cause holes in your brain and people could die from it in raves and so on. But then I read a paper that Michael Mithoefer had published just the year before, showing that they got 83% of people into remission after 3 MDMA sessions. And it just blew me away because I had struggled so hard to get people well from long bouts of PTSD. So I got involved. I got trained as an MDMA therapist. I underwent my own MDMA session as a trainee for that work. It was incredible, so powerful. And I watched people before my eyes get well very quickly who had been stuck for decades with trauma. So that this is a long answer, but by the time that trial was starting to wrap up, I realized that from my perspective, it was already clear that kind of healing work was way more powerful than what I had available in my toolkit as a psychiatrist. And I was facing another existential problem in my career of how do I feel okay about my work, charging people to come in and, pay my fees which are not insignificant as a psychiatrist, to do ordinary therapy and medication management when psychedelic therapy is clearly superior for a lot of people. And that's when I heard about ketamine and started working with ketamine in 2017 and did that for a number of years. So after a while, I started to see the progress toward the end of phase 3 for some of these compounds. And I thought, well, it's time to start teaching people because there's going to be a huge training bottleneck. And that's what led to this institute and what we're doing today.
Yeah. So how did you originally meet up with Keith?
Keith and I met in a men's group when we were, I would say, younger men. We've been friends for a long time. And he's a psychotherapist, and he rented office space from me for a number of years while we were developing our friendship. And he and his wife, when I went through a divorce, introduced me to Krista, who was a great friend of both of theirs, who is my second wife. And so the four of us are a little pod working together to try to keep moving mental health care forward.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting timeline that you mentioned here. And I'm just going to reference the interview that I did last week, which will probably just be out before this interview. That was with Jonathan Robbins. I'm going to open the file, make sure I'm getting his name correctly. But he is a couples therapist. And Jonathan Robinson. Okay, good thing I opened the file. And he said that when he was going through medical school and getting his degree in psychotherapy, that he ended up writing his thesis on MDMA therapy. And he said that right when he completed his degree, that's when MDMA was actually made illegal. In the United States, and so that he couldn't get it published, and that then he practiced for years as a couples therapist, and then it just eventually decided, like, look, it's so much better if I can do couples therapy with couples with MDMA.
Yeah.
And he also talks about how he has developed a methodology for doing that that's very different than the MAPS protocol, where he is engaging with clients during sessions, asking them questions, directing them, which is very different than the MAPS protocol. But you yourself, you came into psychiatry, and then you get introduced to MDMA, and we've sort of been on this progress to this idea that it's going to be legalized, but it hit this major roadblock the other year. And you mentioned like opening up the Psychiatric Institute of Integrative Medicine. Is that correct? Am I saying that correct?
Integrative Psychiatry Institute, same idea. Yeah.
Okay, Integrative Psychiatry Institute. So there's been a lot of prep work to kind of train people, get people interested and aware and educated around how to do this kind of therapy, yet we're still at the point where it's not really happening. And we do have ketamine therapy, but that it's still different than, say, working with psilocybin or working with MDMA.
It's very different. So many ways that it's different. Obviously, ketamine is shorter. The session is shorter. The durability of the benefits is much shorter than MDMA or psilocybin. As you said, it's widely available, so that's helpful. It's also potentially addictive, which MDMA and psilocybin in my book are not. So there's a lot of differences. And we have where you live and where I live, and New Mexico and a few other places are on the way to adopting psilocybin measures. So it's thawing very slowly. And my hope is that we do away with this state by state thing and we just go into a federal approval sometime in the next year or so would be my preference, because it's very confusing. It's very expensive, and it's quite wasteful of state resources, in my opinion. It's redundant, The rules in Colorado are different from Oregon. And then the rules in New Mexico will be different from that, So what are we doing?
Yeah. And I think that they're trying to develop a program in Washington at this point. But it is kind of that problem of does everybody have to create it? And then do we just get wildly different constructs across these different states? And that makes it hard to train people, of course, because we have really specific requirements here in Oregon for how things can even proceed, who can even handle the psilocybin. And that if we did have a more orchestrated national policy, I just think it would be a lot easier. But What as a practitioner, I'm curious, what is your own feeling around what you've already described of being able to observe and experience firsthand that psychedelic therapy really works? I mean, I don't see any argument against that.
Right.
Yet we're still so limited in how we're able to access it.
Well, and I just want to add one more piece to it. It really works. And the other really important piece is that it's so safe. I mean, there are risks. It's not to say this is a panacea. It shouldn't be in the water supply. But when you look at, okay, how many people are dying every day from PTSD or major depression in the absence of effective treatments? And then you've got this tool over here, psilocybin, I'm talking about specifically, that is safer than riding a horse, in David Nutt's study. I mean, it literally is safer than running a horse.
Yeah.
Christopher Reeves, right? I mean, we know the statistics of injuries from horseback riding are much higher injury levels than taking psilocybin. To prohibit that from the public is it's just incredibly sad and disturbing that this is still what we're doing here.
Yeah. And it just must be professionally frustrating.
Yeah, it is. And, I'm not I don't tend toward paranoia or conspiracy theories or things like that, but it does sort of fit into this kind of health industrial complex where pharmaceuticals like SSRIs, for example, which do work for some people in terms of softening symptoms. So I'm not, I've prescribed plenty of antidepressants in my day, and I'm not opposed to doing that. But they are suppressive therapies. They don't actually get to the root of the problem. But they work really well as an investment in a pharmaceutical company because you have to take them every day for the rest of your life for them to keep working. Whereas something like MDMA or psilocybin, you might take once or 3 times or maybe 5 in your lifetime. That's not a great business model for a product that you're trying to sell. Yeah. So it makes you wonder what the motivations actually are in our healthcare system.
Yeah. And it's this interesting phenomenon where then many people around the world are now kind of going through this process of undergoing trainings for how to do psychedelic therapy. And we're going to talk more about that with the model of there is preparation, then there's the session, and then there's integration. And I think that this is enormously useful. But to some degree, we're training more people than we have legal outlets for people to actually practice. And I think it's kind of, I'm happy with that in the sense that, I deal with people seeking integration largely with 5-MeO DMT. And often when they come to me, they say that I couldn't talk to my therapist about this because they wouldn't know what I was talking about. And I would sound crazy if I shared the things. But this is where I think it's really beneficial. If we actually are training more psychiatrists and psychotherapists in psychedelic therapy, then they are more able to at least deal with the integration side of people sharing their experiences and not have it sound like we need to medicate you.
Right, absolutely. I mean, there's a massive need for harm reduction is one way to say it. And that means also when someone on the front end comes to me as a licensed psychiatrist and they say, hey, I think I've been reading about how LSD can help with generalized anxiety. I know it's illegal, but I'm going to do it. And I have some, and I have a person who's going to sit with me. For me to have enough knowledge about LSD or about how that can interact with different medications, what risks I think psychologically LSD might pose for this individual, so I can counsel them in an informed way and not a paranoid and uninformed way, which is what, a lot of people get when they bring it up to their licensed provider, is not great, right? And so then you have people, like you said, who don't feel comfortable talking to their doctor or their therapist about the work that they're doing.
Yeah.
Even if it's healing them. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where a book like yours and Keith's, I think, really comes in very handy in the sense, like, for me, reading the book, I've been in this field for the past 2 decades, and it's like, okay, yeah, I know all this, and I'm not
Yeah.
trying to dismiss the book in any
Yeah.
way. It's just, I've been in this field for a long time, and so I'm familiar with all of these concepts and kind of all the arguments. But what I like about books like this is that it can help legitimize it and really spell it out for people who maybe they're just curious, or maybe they're in the psychiatric profession, or they're a therapist in some modality, but they're just not educated around psychedelic therapy, and maybe still dealing with some of that propaganda around psychedelics and drugs and just say no and all of that. That I think it makes a very persuasive argument, and also provides a good map and model for not only this is why it's beneficial, but this is how we can do it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, we wrote the book actually for the person who's out there who's suffering, or who has a family member who's suffering, who knows nothing about psychedelics. They've never been to Burning Man. They're not going to go to Burning Man. They're not recreational psychedelic users.
Yeah.
But they really need help. And they've heard the messaging from Nancy Reagan and Richard Nixon and all the places that would make you afraid you're going to break your mind if you take a psychedelic, ever. And, it's in a way, I was writing the book for who I was 20 years ago, before I got into the work.
Yeah. So let's start with sort of this distinction. And I think it's an important distinction where standard psychiatric practice, especially regarding medication, often just treats symptoms. And I think it's important not to diminish that in any way, because when you're suffering from debilitating symptoms, if you're able to take something that helps alleviate that, that can be really powerful and transformative for people.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
But it doesn't necessarily get to the root of the issue. So can you share with us your understanding of how is it that psychedelic therapy, and here I want to emphasize the word therapy as opposed to, taking psychedelics at Burning Man, which is fun. I've got nothing against that. I've done that myself. How is the therapy component of work with psychedelics, how is that open up the potential to actually treating what we are calling the root from which the symptoms are arising? What is that distinction? And let's just kind of bring that home for people.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. Well, the first place I think we need to start is in talking about how people like me are trained to diagnose a problem with someone in my office. They come to my office with symptoms, which are experiences that are not desirable experiences. They're ones that we don't want to be having, like anxiety or suicidal thoughts or insomnia, or ruminating, self-defeating belief systems, and so on. People like me are trained with a checklist in mind of, if you have X number of symptoms, then you meet the criteria for a diagnosis of major depression. Outside of PTSD, there's no framework for trying to look for the root cause of the symptom pattern. And the reason that's a problem is that, first of all, even inside of our official diagnosis book, the DSM-5, there's so much overlap between symptom presentations from one category to another of diagnosis. So it's the sort of academic term pathomnemonic, means this set of experiences or symptoms or signs always means this specific diagnosis, this problem. That's not the case in psychiatry. So that's already a problem. But the bigger problem is that we don't ask questions about what's driving, how did this happen to this person in the first place? Here's an example. In childhood, strep throat is common for kids to get strep throat.
Yeah.
OCD is not common, but there are cases where people get strep throat and the antibodies that they make to the streptococcus bacteria cross-react to parts of the brain that can cause OCD. So in a teenager who suddenly develops OCD out of the blue with no prior experiences, one of the things that someone like me, integrative psychiatrist, would do is have them evaluated for the possibility of what's called PANDAS, or post streptococcal. What does it stand for? I'm blanking on it right now, but it's a immunological cross reactivity that can be treated. You don't treat it with an SSRI, which is how you treat OCD in general. Now, so the point is that there are lots of different kinds of underlying issues, root causes that can be driving a person's symptoms. Here's another example. People who have sensitivity to gluten, who are eating a lot of wheat, commonly will also have anxiety, and they may have rashes, they might have insomnia. And I've seen in my practice many times where we run that test, comes back positive, stop eating wheat, and the anxiety over time gradually melts away. And then sometimes we peel back the medication and they still have no anxiety. It's happened a number of times in my practice. So the point is that a conventional evaluation from a conventional doctor doesn't take these things into account. They define the symptoms as the disorder, and they define the resolution or the remission from the disorder as the absence of symptoms. But anyone who's ever taken an SSRI for one of these conditions knows that when you stop taking it, your symptoms typically come back. Maybe not right away, maybe in 6 months, maybe a year. But the point is that they're not addressing anything at the root cause level. So what most people want, in my experience, having treated thousands of people, is they would rather get a treatment that addresses the root causes that allows them to walk away eventually from treatment, rather than getting snared in treatment with ineffective tools. It's like, well, here's another metaphor. Like, okay, you get a puncture in your tire on your bicycle, and you walk down to the bike shop, and they say, well, we could replace the inner tube, or we could put a patch on that kind of works for a day or two.
Yeah.
But you're going to have to keep pumping it up every day. What would you choose? Would you spend $5 for an inner tube, or would you choose to just pump up your tire every day for the rest of your life? Much better to get to the root cause, so you can put psychiatry behind you, which is what I think these tools are about, and they carry that subversive quality to them as well. But practitioners, that every practitioner I've met doesn't want to participate in this medical industrial complex where we're not treating the root causes. Practitioners want to be a part of the solution, not part of the problem. So they want better tools, which is part of why this work is so popular right now for people to get trained, even though we don't have a federal approval yet for the traditional psychedelics.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that sometimes things get very adversarial out in public around, oh, well, they just want you, they want you just to be addicted to your symptoms and the medications. But I think it's also important to note that I think that most people who work in healthcare, they really do want to help people, right? They want to treat root causes. So this is where psychedelic therapy I think it's becoming of great interest to many people, because there is the hope that, well, maybe we can actually treat the root cause. And it's not that the traditional psychiatrist wants people, on lifelong medication. It's just they might not know what's another approach.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They don't know any better yet, but we're working on it.
Yeah. So then back to the question of, how does psychedelic therapy actually get to the root cause? What are the mechanisms and modalities through which that occurs? Right.
So if we broadly talk about the root cause that I think is most effectively addressed with psychedelic therapy, it's trauma. So, and we should probably define that, because there's a lot of sort of pushback about the overuse of the term.
Yeah.
Kind of mainstreaming and stripping out the meaning behind the term. When I use the word trauma, I'm talking about a set of dysregulation inside of the nervous system of the individual that is causing them harm. It's causing the people around them harm. It's causing them harm. It's not allowing them to live their lives, to fulfill their dreams, to be in touch with their deepest truth, of what their gifts are to give in the world, and so on. So that dysregulation in the nervous system may be, in some cases, traceable to an event, a car accident or an assault or, a rape or fall from a ladder. But more commonly, and this is why trauma is so insidious in our culture, is that people develop traumatic patterning in their nervous system based on what we call little t trauma. So events that wouldn't register as a major event, like 9/11 type of event or something like that. These are events where chronic misattunement, chronic experiences in childhood of abuse or neglect that are subtle cause the individual growing up in that environment to develop beliefs about their life and what's possible for their lives and for their relationships in their lives that are quite colored by the experience of trauma. I'm not important. My voice doesn't matter. These are common core beliefs that it's not just my idea, but trauma therapists, psychedelic therapists see this all the time emerging on the psychedelic when we get into the dosing session, that people might come in saying, well, I'm having a problem in my life with my boss in the current present day. But the psychedelic often will bring forward the earlier patterning that led to why you're working for that person in the first place, how you attracted that person into your life, and so on. So the root cause, I think, most identifiable and useful around psychedelic therapy is trauma. Some of these medical root causes that I was mentioning earlier, you can work with a functional medicine provider or a doctor who has a broader range of tools.
Yeah. So would you feel it's accurate to say that, at least in some circumstances within psychedelic therapy, that the psychedelic kind of works as a pattern exposer and disruptor, that it takes an unconscious pattern that had been developed through, as you say, these traumatic events that could be a series of little things, or it could be a certain condition in which somebody was raised or exposed, or it could be a large traumatic event. But that then the difficulty with trauma, this is what we're understanding. I mean, this whole work with trauma is relatively new in the therapeutic world of understanding how this works, but that then people develop unconscious beliefs and patterns because of that trauma, and that they carry that forward into current and future relationships and events in a way that might be a mismatch between what's actually occurring and the expectations and sort of the unconscious beliefs that are embedded within that trauma response. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. And I would expand it just a little bit more to say that no matter what kind of childhood we grew up in, our belief systems about life, about ourselves, about others is a reflection of what we grew up in. We don't know anything different, right? Having, in my case, a alcoholic, eventually federal criminal, felony kind of prisoner guy, father, I didn't know that was, impacting me as a child. I wasn't sitting there thinking, oh, this is a traumatic belief I'm developing right now. It's like, I was just trying to survive, in my life and figure it out. And then lo and behold, I start, experiencing things in my adult life that reflect these core beliefs that then need to be remodeled to update the system so that I can see the world with fresh eyes every day, which I think is critical to us having mental health, is to be able to face our lives now as if we're in the now versus in the past.
So I'm just going to present the skeptic response would be, yeah. Well, why do you need a psychedelic to do that? Like, why can't you just do that in regular therapy? What makes you want to, quote, use drugs?
Right. So, well, first of all, not everyone needs psychedelics. So I'm not here to be an evangelist and say that everyone should should do that. I think Timothy Leary's, perspective was quite radical, and I wouldn't agree with it on a lot of levels. But there are cases where people, and I saw this especially in the clinical trial work that I did with MAPS, where people have had experiences with therapy, they've had experiences with psychiatry. I've seen people get well after 3 MDMA sessions who had 1,000 therapy sessions before they went into MDMA therapy. Now, what should we tell that person that they need to do 1,000 therapy sessions before they get MDMA for their PTSD? Maybe not. Maybe we could say, why don't we save this person 3 decades of suffering and maybe get started with MDMA therapy earlier? I'm a huge fan of EMDR. I trained under Peter Levine and a big fan of somatic experiencing. I think there's a lot of different ways to get well without psychedelics. But the trouble here is that a lot of what's driving the energy of the traumatic patterning in the nervous system is not conscious. And so it sometimes takes a big intervention like a near-death experience or a psychedelic therapy session, or some other kind of event that just really rattles your tree enough that you get to see a different perspective for a few minutes or an hour or more.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that response. And I think it really does. Now I'm speaking on the other side, that I think it comes down to, especially when we have intractable issues where people are not feeling relief or not feeling transformation, that they want additional help. And here's an avenue. And that, as you say, that if we introduce a psychedelic intervention or a therapy option earlier on in people's trajectory, it could potentially relieve a lot of unnecessary suffering along the way, rather than saying, you've got to do 1,000 hours. Like, well, maybe we can start here. Or at least consider starting here, and then maybe that will get you relief sooner, and therefore everyone's feeling better.
Right. Exactly. And and there's also this other kind of maybe more philosophical perspective of who's in charge of my choices around what kind of consciousness I want to explore in my human body in this lifetime, and do I have to risk incarceration or at least a misdemeanor or something negative in order to experiment with different realms of consciousness and exploring the inner landscape?
Yeah, so that actually brings me to a question that I wanted to talk to you about, and this seems like this might be a good opportunity to kind of raise this issue, and it will help us kind of clarify more what we mean by psychedelic psychotherapy itself. So the question revolves around how obviously, there's been a lot of movement and change in the psychedelic world in the past couple of decades. And some of the things that we're seeing, for one, there's kind of always been underground psychedelic therapists and psychotherapists. Right. They're still here. They're hard to find. They're hard for clients to access, but they've been here. They're still here. Then we have the slow movement into legal psychedelic therapy, which, as we've discussed, that's mostly been around ketamine so far. And we have sort of these limited little windows around psilocybin. But like even here in Oregon, you're not allowed to call it therapy and you're not allowed to practice as a therapist. Right. So you have to find a therapist outside of the psilocybin program who's familiar with psilocybin that maybe you can talk to your experiences about. And then another place that we've seen a lot of change, and I know that this is big in Colorado, just like it is here in Oregon, where we have the development of psychedelic and entheogenic churches, which are about spiritual exploration, but we also know that a lot of people are going to them because they are seeking some avenue of relief and transformation of their symptoms of depression or anxiety. And then, of course, we also have psychedelic retreats, which have really mushroomed in number over recent years, which I think are more and more are adopting sort of the psychotherapeutic model around preparation, dosing, and integration versus just show up, have your dose, and then go home. Right. But what makes psychedelic therapy different in this context? And I'm curious if you have any concerns around these other modalities where essentially a lot of people are self-treating because they've heard psychedelics are very effective. I can't find a legal route to do this or a legal therapeutic route. So I'm going to go to an entheogenic church, or I'm going to go to a retreat, or I'm going to try and find an underground therapist. And I would even say there's lots of underground facilitators who aren't therapists and aren't trained in these modalities. So how does psychedelic therapies, psychotherapy in particular, how does that stand out within this increasingly crowded field?
Well, I think it might be helpful to start by talking about some of the numbers that we have, at least 10 million people with PTSD in America. And I don't know how many underground therapists there are, but there aren't enough of them to, even if they were all ethically bound by practice standards, which they're not, which is also a problem. But even if what they were, and there was a directory and you could access them, you couldn't treat all the people who need treatment.
Oh.
And that's just PTSD. When you look at treatment-resistant depression, the number that is currently being put out by the World Health Organization is 100 million people worldwide who have that condition. 300 to 350 million. These are numbers that just kind of blow your mind when you start thinking about how many people need help in the world. So first of all, just on an access level, it kind of goes back to what I was saying about, my mom's not going to go to Burning Man. She's not going to go find an underground therapist. But if her psychiatrist said, look, there's been advances in the field. The SSRI you've been on for, 25 years is okay. I mean, you're sort of functioning barely, but we've got something better for you to consider. And it's now been FDA approved. She would probably consider doing something like that, especially if insurance covered the treatment. So I think the big problem, as far as I'm concerned, is, well, there's really two of them. One is, I think we need standards and ways of making sure that everyone is adequately trained, especially around ethics. I know people who have been abused in the underground. I know there are a lot of practitioners in the underground who are excellent, who do great work. So I'm not here to, condemn the underground. I think a lot of beautiful healing happens. But in terms of the access, the amount of people who need help, it's just not going to happen without having it become adopted as a mainstream treatment. But it is a radical shift in our culture, and especially medical culture and psychiatric culture, to pivot toward excavating and allowing the things that are inside of you, amplifying them so they can be dealt with and healed, as opposed to let's suppress everything so you can just, function. And like you said, I just want to underline this, nothing wrong with symptom suppression. Symptom suppression is helpful. In my opinion, it's just incomplete. It's just not a full result.
Yeah. So let's spell it out a little bit more clearly now. And I like to give examples for contrast. So one of the things I've shared with people, with my own clients and, with my own students and here on the podcast is that, this whole idea around preparation, then the dosing, and then integration, that it's a relatively new concept. It's a relatively new model. And I like to just bring out the contrast and share like how I was regularly attending the local Santo Daime church back in 2008 and 2009 when they were going through their court case with the federal government to secure their religious freedom access to Daime, ayahuasca. And what I like to share is, I had like a little interview, like, why do you want to come? Right. Then there's an interview. And then it was, okay, well, here's the ceremony. These are the songs. And then, are you coming back next weekend? And so there's lots of medicine consumption, and there's some discussion of like doctrine, of the church and things like that. But there was no preparation. There's no integration. I mean, it's a church, so you're taking a sacrament. You're joining in communion, and then people who attended, they certainly would claim certain amounts of healing and transformation within themselves. For me, it was a particularly potent time that I would describe as a kind of an energetic reformatting that I was going through. But it was I was all on my own with that. Like that was my experience, and even there was kind of the idea that your experiences are your own and that you really shouldn't be talking about them with other people.
Right.
And that was fine. I was on my own process, but it's very different than this idea of I'm getting therapy, right?
Yeah.
There was no integration, no preparation. So let's just spell out, what is this model this basic
Yeah.
model of psychedelic psychotherapy and why it is developed this way to make it more effective for, especially when we get into the section on integration, about where do we move from insights into lasting transformation? Where do we go from an experience to now this is a new trait, this is a new habit, this is something that is integrated into my mode of being?
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, there's a religious scholar named Houston Smith at UCLA who was famous for saying the purpose of spiritual practice is to turn state change into trait change. So human development, human growth, getting more well over the course of our lives means that we have to take the states, these heightened states, and psychedelics is a great example where you might have massive insight at a church or in a traditional ceremony setting, Native American church, or any spiritual setting, and you might write it down in your journal. But if you don't engage in behavior change, if you don't keep coming back to the insights and keep working them and trying to understand how they change your worldview, or what behaviors need to change in your life, like people will often have insights like, wow, I'm poisoning my body with fast food. And you wake up to that in an ayahuasca ceremony, and then a week later you find yourself at Taco Bell again. It's like, well, what happened, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about integration is taking the insights or the changes, the awarenesses, and building them into change in your life. And so one of the big differences between the religious context and the psychotherapy context is the goals are different. The intentions are different. So people do go to psychedelic churches with conditions, diagnoses that they want relief from. That's for sure. But it's not a psychotherapy format. And oftentimes, as you pointed out, people are actively instructed that, look, you're going to have an experience and you're responsible for it. And you need to contain your experience and be with your experience. Not to say that people don't get loud or they don't get messy or vomit or shout or whatever happens. But it isn't a one-on-one setup. So the set and setting of a psychotherapeutic environment makes the core material that needs to come out easier to come out, because you're not entering a circle where, in a religious context, where you might have people on both sides of you or in front of you or behind you, and you kind of have your space, but you're on your own, basically, to hold your experience. And there's tremendous value in those experiences. I'm not putting that down at all, but it is not set up ideally, in my opinion, for healing, where people need to have a dedicated person there with them from the beginning until the end, who's there to make sure that they're safe and to ask good questions and protect the vulnerability and the suggestibility of that person in that context. Preparation is sort of about, what are you here to do? What experiences are you having that you don't want to be having? Where do we think that those might be coming from? And I like to say that integration starts in the preparation. So what does your life look like? Are you very isolated? Do you sit on the couch all day? What does your food look like? What's your sleep hygiene look like? There's a lot of things that you and I might think of as basic that people can't get a hold of because they're so under the wheel of their depression or their PTSD. That is going to have to be a part of their integration. And it's not necessarily sexy or fun, but getting a certain amount of steps every day, getting to bed at the right time every day, revamping the things that you're eating, putting yourself out there to develop meaningful friendships in your life. I mean, these are all necessary, basic, fundamental aspects of health that when we only look at psychedelics as a pharmaceutical cure, we're forgetting about all those things, right? Yeah. We're not dealing with those things. And so then the benefits are going to be less. in the long run.
So it sounds like you're saying that in terms of preparation for psychedelic psychotherapy, that it's more than just about the conditions that are bringing you into seeking therapy, but especially if you're taking an integrative medicine approach, that you're really trying to look holistically, like what are all these different factors and elements? Where can we provide relief outside of any kind of medication,
Right.
lifestyle changes? But then it's the deep dark stuff, the difficult to resolve stuff. That tends to be what's bringing people in
Yeah.
for psychedelic psychotherapy.
Right.
So then, how does one prepare around those issues? Let's say we get all the diet, we get the sleep hygiene, we
Hmm.
get media consumption, we get all of that taken
Yeah.
care of. Then what are the steps? Again, within this therapeutic model,
Hmm.
how are people preparing? And as you say, that really contributes to their integration afterwards. So what are the steps that they need to bring into? And also, just for anybody who's listening who might be considering, like, yeah, I'd like to be a psychedelic psychotherapist, in terms of how do they need to be guiding people within these processes, which again might be very different from how you're preparing people for a religious ceremony or for a
Right.
retreat session or something like
Right.
that.
Right. Definitely. Well, of course, there is also the medical screening aspect of making sure that it's medically aligned. Is the person taking medication that might not be compatible? In Oregon, as you know, they have a preparation, basically check sheet where you have to check boxes to say, I'm not taking lithium, and I this and that and the other thing. Is the person pregnant? Do we know, how this might affect a pregnancy, right? If they're going to take a psychedelic and so on. So there are those things that need to be talked about. But I think what you're talking about maybe is more of the deep dark stuff, and how do we prepare people for that experience? It's pretty hard to describe what a psychedelic state is going to feel like to someone who hasn't been in one before, especially because the one who hasn't been in one before could be in any kind of state once you give them the medicine. So they could be having, union with God experience. They could be having a, you know, depths of hell experience. I mean, this is the original 1950s conversation between Aldous Huxley and his psychiatrist in Canada was
Yeah.
like, you could either go to heaven or hell, and you
Right.
take a pinch of psychedelic, right? So that's really important to prepare people as much as you can for having a flexible, open mindset about what may occur. Um, I think one of the big things that we've seen in the work that we've done with people is people are busy. People are parenting, they may have multiple jobs, they might not be able to take a lot of time off for the session itself. And sometimes, because the state of openness after a psilocybin experience or even ketamine can last for days, right? There can be a tail where people are very sensitive and very suggestible, very open. And for those folks to have to go straight back to work like the very next day after a dosing session is really sad. But it's real for a lot of people. They can't take more than one day off. So I really try to lean in and work with people around who's your support system, who are you going home to, do you have a person in your life who you can share some of the things you went through if you want to. We have learned the hard way that, so we advise people not to share with people that they don't fully trust how that person feels about what they just did, because there's a lot of judgment in the world
Yeah.
about,
Yeah.
psychedelics. And to really, one of the things I learned the most about my work with MAPS was learning about this concept of the inner healing intelligence. And I'd never heard that term before as a psychiatrist before I started training to be a MAPS MDMA therapist. And this concept that people already have a place in them where they hold the wisdom and all the answers that they need to access to know what to do, how to move forward in their life. They just need safety and guidance, minimal guidance to find that, was kind of I was very skeptical that was a real thing until I, saw it happening in front of me. where, someone's having a conversation with themselves on MDMA, and the traumatized part of their psychology is listening to the wise part saying, it's not your fault. What happened? This traumatic event, like, you didn't ask for that. Sure, you were there and you were a part of it, but look at all of these other factors that were involved. And so helping people to open their mind to having wisdom inside of themselves that they may not have ever touched before or don't believe in is something that I find is really useful as well, because it can be very empowering to do the work that way with people.
Yeah. So to come back to something that you mentioned briefly before that I think is very important is this idea that in the psychedelic psychotherapy session, it's really important to allow space for vulnerability and to really allow people to go through their process. And this is definitely something that I've seen as a limitation in either the ceremonial context or even the retreat context, where, sometimes I'll get an integration client and they'll tell me that they were told they were making too much noise, or they were screaming too loudly, or they were taking up too much space or too much attention. And in these sensitive situations, sometimes that was something really important for somebody to go through. And then that actually contributes to an increase in their symptomology afterwards, because it creates a rebound effect where now they're shutting down what potentially could have been a therapeutic process. So you had mentioned this idea of the one-on-one session as providing more space for this allowance of vulnerability and for processing. Can you share more about that? And also, I'm curious, do you yourself see a difference between the MAPS model, which relies on the inner healer, right? Like in the dosing session, oftentimes the therapist is just there to make sure the person is safe, versus like what I mentioned earlier with Jonathan Robinson, where he performs couples therapy with couples on MDMA, where he will engage them in conversation, ask them leading questions in the same way that he would outside of the therapy session. So I'm curious on your thoughts on all of those topics. Sorry, that was kind of a bunch.
No, it's great. I think that I don't think the MAPS protocol is the only way to get people well with psychedelic therapy, for sure. But I'm also aware that as a psychiatrist, I tend to be a know-it-all. And I think a lot of therapists are unaware of how strong their biases are or their opinions are. And it's a beautiful opportunity if you try to practice this open curiosity as a facilitator, to actively counter inside of to work against the part of yourself that thinks, I know what's going on for this client right now. I know the smart question or the cool thing to say right now that's going to really help them, and to, rather than engaging in interpretation or subtly guiding the person towards something, to ask questions and to stay in the beginner's mind, if you will, as much as possible. I think when we have more access and more ability to experiment with different protocols, we're going to find out more about how different things can work. There was a paper that just came out a few days ago by Charlie Grob at UCLA. He's been a very active psychedelic researcher for decades. And the protocol was CBT before and after psilocybin therapy. And it was helpful for the people who went through it, so for depression. So hopefully we'll see lots more of these kinds of mixed protocols and people doing their own thing and writing about it, and we'll all learn from it. I think that the trouble that I have with talking to people too much on MDMA specifically, or really any psychedelic therapy, is that that where the action is in the healing is usually nonverbal, is my experience. It's not always nonverbal, and people sometimes need to process and they need to tell you what's going on. But the parts of the brain that are holding and getting the blood flow that's driving the energy behind the trauma tend not to be very verbal parts of the brain. So we can, so to speak, waste the precious opportunity of the few hours on MDMA if we're engaging on a cognitive level with people. Meanwhile, the traumatic material is under the surface and it's staying there because we're engaging the person on the cognitive level. So I think that's the counterpoint to doing too much talking. And I've been the one who was doing too much talking as the MDMA therapist. And I've had people, what's nice about MDMA is people will just say, you know what, you're talking too much right now.
So kind of along those lines, personally, I'm always very interested, as you say, in the nonverbal aspects, which seem to show up for many people very somatically, where there are events happening in the body. And within that, I would include emotions, because emotions are waves of energy that we experience in the body. That emotions are not disembodied. They're not floating off in the psyche somewhere, that they're happening here in the body. We see physiological responses. So in other words, people crying, people screaming, people laughing, and then also tremors in the body, or purging, or gagging, or frothing at the mouth, or mucus coming out of the nose, or, and sometimes, stuff comes out of the lower parts of the body as well. So how do you see that as part, or do you see that as part of the psychotherapeutic process in a psychedelic session? And then how do therapists make room for that? Recognizes that sometimes it gets really messy. Like, I know not so much with the MDMA or ketamine, but if we're introducing psilocybin mushrooms, or if we're talking about ayahuasca or 5-MeO, we're getting into realms where there can be a lot of somatic events that are taking place.
Absolutely. And we saw quite a bit of somatic processing in the MDMA clinical trials as well. It's critical, and this is also part of the update that we're seeing in mental health care. It's still not mainstream, and there are a lot of people working on this to make it mainstream, to show that trauma expresses itself somatically a lot. And many people with PTSD know this. Born on the 4th of July, like the firecracker goes off and you have an experience in your body. It's not a verbal, you're not thinking, oh, that's a firecracker, or, oh, that's a bomb. No, your body is responding immediately to that, right? And the way we process and heal trauma is often very much about sequencing things through the body. And I personally think that kind of sequencing and processing is often a lot more valuable than talking about what's happening. So when you get experienced as a psychedelic therapist, you start to recognize patterns where the body is processing something. And inside of your own experience, you're excited because you see that the person, their body is actually starting to do something that's going to lead to relief for them. It didn't used to be thought that there was anything to do with the body that had to do with mental health. And that, it's starting to fall away, that view, the Cartesian split, right, between the mind and the body.
Yeah.
So this is also a place where training becomes really important, because if a therapist has never had their own personal experience of becoming a hot mess, right? Snot coming out, like you said, just being very unpresentable, quote unquote. Like, you're not going to go on the Today Show and try to look like that. You're going to try to look like you're put together, kind of thing. Letting all that down and having experiences of darkness inside of yourself gives you the confidence to deliver that holding for people who need to go through that. And if you haven't had it as a sitter or a therapist, the likelihood is you're going to get anxious when someone's going through a process that's big. And then you're going to, not with bad intent, but you're going to unconsciously treat your own anxiety that you're having by intervening on the client prematurely or too much. And it interferes with the process. And so they may not get the full resolution that they could have gotten if you were more relaxed, because you'd had a chance to explore your inner psyche and gone into the scary places in there. Really important.
Yeah. And that goes back then to allowing that vulnerability with clients I'm a big proponent of the one-on-one session, that I think that allows people the safest space to experience that, because it is so vulnerable. And when these kinds of things present in the body, as you say, it is a hot mess. It does get messy. People do feel very self-conscious often afterwards, like, wow, look at what I did. But in the moment, it's what they really feel is that actually is the cathartic transformation that's taking place by that encountering of that material. And I would also emphasize that it can also be extremely pleasurable for people. That's another side of it, where people go into ecstasy, or it might be some kind of bliss or orgasmic kind of experience, but it's allowing that safe space of the therapeutic session to allow all that. And that, in agreement with what you say, we definitely need therapists who are trained in understanding what is normal, so that they're not overreacting or overly concerned, or then even shaming someone around what that process was.
Right. Or in the case of psychiatry, medicating it, right? So having, I've got a little bit of Xanax or Ativan here just in case you start freaking out, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to sit here with you. I'm going to breathe with you, and we're going to get through this together, right? And you're going to earn the resilience that only comes from facing something really hard and going through it and not medicating it. It's a different style, and I think it's a lot more empowering for people.
I think it is as well. And one of the things I like to emphasize is that the mind can be extraordinarily tricky, and we can trick and lie to ourselves, and we can delude ourselves, but the body is honest.
Yeah.
That the body tells the truth. And that, so when we access through that modality, we're much more likely to encounter the truth, whether it's dark or light or whatever it may be, than if we're trying to figure it out in the mind. That it's the direct access route. And that this is where I totally disagree with Rene Descartes, that for me, the mind is fully embodied in the body, and that it's not some separate disincarnate thing that's floating around.
Absolutely. Well, and we know, even just if you look at the polyvagal or the vagal nerve, the 10th cranial nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system, very involved in trauma and dysregulation in the nervous system. And it innervates every organ in the body. It goes everywhere. Vagus in Latin means wandering, so it goes everywhere in your body. And it sends the signals of either regulation or dysregulation, as the case may be, everywhere. So, and when you talk to veterans who come back with combat trauma, they very often will complain about a lot of digestive problems. Why is that? Because the vagal nerve is dysregulated and it's innervating the intestines. So, there's all kinds of examples where, even all the way back to Freud, where Freud called it conversion disorder, where the emotions become a physical symptom in the body. Well, it's not conversion, it's just how the body works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So kind of along a similar thread, I was curious to ask you about this particular topic, because it's come up on occasion with clients that I work with on integration, where they share with me during their psychedelic session, they had a memory of some abuse or some traumatic event that they say, well, it felt really real, but now on this side of the experience, I actually don't trust that memory. I'm a little bit worried that I introduced a false memory into my own personal narrative, because it doesn't fit with my recollection of that time in my life or something like that. And I'm curious if that's something that you've seen, and how would you address that as a psychotherapist? Because as we know, for some people, they do uncover genuine traumatic memories and they're able to confirm those. But what happens when somebody is not able to confirm those memories? What advice would you give?
Such a great question. So to me, this has come up, and it comes up a lot, is the questioning. I think about memories, and if we could say recovered memories, and I don't mean by recovered memories saying false memories, but just memories that came up during a session, or images. All of it to me is useful to hold with a light touch. There's no, as far as I can tell, there's no benefit to constructing a new identity or a new narrative around something that may have happened or maybe didn't happen. the freedom from trauma is about having a nervous system that's regulated. It's not about identifying uh, what happened to me, and therefore my whole life is now about what happened to me. It's about cleaning the slate and having a lighter, the work of Robin Card Harris, who's one of the kind of preeminent psychedelic therapy researchers looking at mechanisms. The best he can come up with as far as like what does it mean to get well from psychedelic therapy is something he calls psychological flexibility. So having the ability to hold who we are with a light touch, maybe this memory occurred in real life, or maybe it's a dream, but dreams can also be incredibly informative and helpful. But I'm not going to go out of the ayahuasca ceremony and tell my friends, hey, I slayed a dragon last night for real. Like I did, like, and that's my new identity. Like I'm a knight, or whatever. So, but the empowerment or the strength or the having my own back feeling of like, yeah, I faced something really hard last night can be really meaningful and beautiful and powerful to carry forward with you. So yeah, I don't think it really hinges on, okay, did this happen or not? It's sort of like what does the memory what does exploring the memory and turning it over in our mind and trying to understand who do we want to be going forward, how does it serve that purpose?
Yeah. Well, I really like that emphasis on handling it with a light touch. And I'm not trying to dig on anyone or anything like that, but this is something that I've seen that I guess I would identify as a little bit more problematic when people are served psychedelics in a spiritual or religious context, because often there is sort of this quest of, I want to uncover my purpose or my special identity, and that these things can then be really solidly reinforced afterwards. Like if somebody shares like, oh, well, I had this experience, and then it's like, okay, this is now who you are based on this experience, versus I really like what you just said, that we don't need to go out and build a new identity or a new story around that if we hold it lightly. And what I like to use is, I tell people like, yeah, well, I get really excited about things that happen in Star Wars. I've been a big Star Wars fan since I was a little kid. I know none of that is real, but I can still be emotionally impacted when Luke discovers that Vader is his father, and then
Right.
that can make me reflect on my own life, that I can still learn and feel a lot from that, but I don't have to say, yeah, it's objectively true. I don't have to reify it in that sense. And I think that that's a really important part of where I think psychedelic psychotherapy can powerfully differ from maybe some of these other modalities where people might be exploring psychedelics in reality.
Well, I think the issue of identity is a critical topic for us to all face in our lives. How do we, what is the story we're telling about ourselves? How does that serve us? How does it limit us? Where does it come from? Are we sovereign in the authorship of our narrative? And it's common and I'm speaking from experience, when I became a Buddhist practitioner in my early 30s, I started, it took me a few years to realize I was doing this, but I could tell that I was subtly looking down on my family for not being as awake as I was.
Yeah.
And it was just incredibly humbling and painful to wake up to that. But the point of the story is that it's human nature for us to keep trying to level up our identity.
Mm.
And we just have to keep an eye on that. And we have to, I think if we're lucky, we can have a sense of humor about it. And if we don't have a sense of humor about it, we're probably going to get humbled at some point and hopefully develop one.
Yeah. So I think that that's a good segue now into the topic more specifically around integration, which is broadly construed as what happens next after the session. And here, I think that there might be some different approaches. If we're taking a psychotherapeutic approach than, say, integrating after like a religious ceremony or even a retreat. So what would you want to identify as really significant within this particular modality with this topic of integration, in addition to the fact that it's an integral part of the process with psychotherapy?
Yeah, it's so important. We can't we can't overestimate that. I mean, I'd say it's 90% of the work. The dosing session is a place where you get a glimpse of what could be possible in your life, and then you have to do the after the ecstasy, the laundry, as Jack Kornfield said, right? So we have to work hard to make that state change into a trait change, and that takes a lot of different forms for different people. Um, Generally speaking, the experience of 30,000-foot view or seeing the forest for the trees, or okay, now I see how I've constructed my life, and here's how, my early childhood caused me or helped me to develop these strategies in my life that are very limiting now, and I need to change those. Kind of leaves you with, most of the time, not always, but oftentimes, with a list of things that we're going to be wanting to look at in integration. For example, someone who I worked with who was beaten nearly to death by a person that they trusted. The result, among other things, was deep isolation, not being around people at all, living far away from city, and arranging life around avoiding the trigger of fear of being around other people. And so part of the healing process for that person was, wow, I'm going to have to figure out how to tolerate getting reps of going somewhere around people and maybe making a friend and seeing how that goes. And incredibly terrifying, in the beginning to take that on. But in the dosing session, like, okay, this is something I need to do, the internal awareness. Mm-hmm. Not the therapist saying, hey, you need to go do this after we're done here, but the person saying, I need to go do this. Yeah. So doing the hard work is key, no matter what the domain is that the person is going to need to address and change.
Yeah. So that really leans into the idea that it is work afterwards, that this is, okay, you've uncovered insights, maybe you've had a cathartic process, but that we're not relying on this psychedelic session itself to magically transform your life. Just like, oh, I had a session, so now everything's going to be good. But yeah, it often means stepping into areas that we might be uncomfortable with to make positive change.
Right. And you can pretty much bank on the fact that it's going to be uncomfortable because you've been avoiding it because it's uncomfortable. Right. So things that the habits that we have formed usually are formed around creating a life that's less uncomfortable. It's just human nature. So if that means that we're going to have to take up some kind of exercise practice or some, like I said earlier, example of relational, challenge yourself to grow that way, or maybe you have to overcome addiction to processed foods or substances or other things that are not good for you in your current new awareness of what you need to do to have a healthy experience of being human. Much of it is attending in a mental health context. Much of it is attending to these basic needs, in particular relationship and how to have your own back in relationship, but also how to have meaningful connection with people.
So what would you want to put out there as the proper guidelines for those who are offering integration, the psychotherapist, whoever it may be, the coach or guide? Where's the line between encouraging people or maybe even sometimes discouraging people? Like, as we know, sometimes people come out of a psychedelic session as like, this is what I have to do. And, right. I'm going to divorce my partner and I'm going to fly to India. Like, this is the message I've received. So sometimes we might want to say, maybe not. And then other times we might want to nudge someone to how does one live that balance of being the sounding board for someone, offering reflection and advice, but not be the authority that tells them what to do or what not to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot of practitioners have paperwork that says, look, you have to agree not to make any major life changes in the next 48 hours after the session. And I think that's pretty wise, because some of these dramatic insights of I need to leave my family and move to India can wear off pretty quickly. Um, I had a teacher, a Brazilian Santo Daime teacher, who shared a story that someone in one of his sessions woke up to the abuse that his father had. And it was a question of like, is this a real memory or not a real memory? But
Yeah.
the person in the ceremony who received that information went straight to his father's house and knocked on the door and yelled at his father. His father had a heart attack. So these are important things that have real consequences for people if they're not held and prepared and supported in integration properly, for sure. I think the question of how do you not be the one who's telling them what to do, or I think it has to do with questions rather than statements or interpretations. Like, well, have you considered that, you know, I hear you that you want to move to the ashram in India and leave your family, but have you considered what your children might face if you just disappeared? What if we took a few months, to talk through this, with your partner or, your spouse or whoever? Or what if we explored all the ins and outs of this big decision you want to make, leaving your career, whatever, before you immediately jump off the cliff without a parachute? Let's talk about your plan B. Let's talk about what the consequences might be of this choice.
Yeah.
So you're kind of lending the superego or the, conscience to the person until they have it more online.
Yeah. And I think that really speaks to why training programs that educate people around how to ask these right kinds of questions. What is the role of the therapist? How do you give support? That's why it's important to have training so that people aren't just leaning into whatever the narratives might be or whatever the immediate jump to I've got to do this or got to do that. And I also like what you just mentioned, the idea of maybe these contracts and agreements. And that's something that I've seen a lot more development of in the psychedelic facilitation space. And sometimes it is even, I agree that I will not leave the facilitation space until the facilitator or the therapist tells me it is okay because I've run the course, because that's another one that shows up where as soon as like, no, I'm done, people want to leave. And then also the agreement to participating in integration, right? And kind of spelling all these things out. And in our culture, we love it when if we put something on paper, it's like magic. It's like it's real. And so it make people sign it and read it and sign it.
That's right.
Which I think is significant, that creating that therapeutic contract.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and another way that I like to frame it is like the session's not over until you and I both agree that it's over. Not unilateral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you very much for your time today. We've really covered a lot of topics. I could ask you more about all of this pretty much indefinitely and get your input, but I do want to kind of move into letting you go at this point because I've had you for 90 minutes. But I do want to ask a little bit about you're in Colorado, and this is one of the places where things are moving forward. What can you tell us about where are things at in Colorado right now in terms of psilocybin, psychedelic therapy in general? How are things going there?
Yeah. Well, we're brand new compared to you in Oregon. We have a number of service centers that have opened. We have dosing sessions happening, so it's underway. Cultivation and testing and services. There are several hundred people who have been licensed as facilitators. It's a little different here. You may be aware that you mentioned earlier that you're not allowed to be practicing therapy while you're facilitating psilocybin in Oregon. That's my understanding as well. And in Colorado, it's different because Colorado decided to put licensure for psilocybin sessions under the same structure as medical and psychotherapeutic licensing. So it's a special license that is it's called a secondary license in addition to your therapy license or medical license. So I don't know if that's going to matter in terms of, I mean, the malpractice insurer that I have told me already that they're not going to cover psilocybin. So I don't know how that's going to work for me, but we're underway. And the Colorado Natural Medicine Act also has ibogaine under it. So that will be a next step as we start to unfold that and try to understand how that might get rolled out in the next year or two.
Yeah. And in terms of psilocybin sessions, I'm curious, is there much flexibility there? So for example, we had talked a little bit about here in Ashland that there's one place that's now closed that they were offering one-on-one sessions. Others are more group oriented. Then there's a place called the Mushroom Cafe, where if they allow like small microdosing that you can
really?
take on site and then also maybe enjoy a music performance there. But of course, I've had some people say that they really want to offer like mushroom hikes, like nature therapy, but that you have to be at a licensed facility. So that there's a little flexibility, but there's not a whole lot. What's the status there in Colorado?
I'm trying to remember off the top of my head what Colorado decided to do for the end of life. There was a big discussion, and it went back and forth for a long time about whether they were going to allow sessions at home for people at the end of life, or anywhere outside of a service center. And I can't remember what was decided on that. I have to go look that up. I think there were limited circumstances where that was going to be allowed, but as far as like outside and hikes and so on, I don't think it's allowed in Colorado.
Yeah. One last little topic that I'm just curious if you have anything that you'd want to share on that. Because you mentioned it, but the natural medicine movement, the idea of decriminalizing nature, which I like that as sort of a wedge issue of just bringing out the absurdity of this exists in nature, and yet we have laws saying that we can't interact with it. And so I like that from that intellectual standpoint. What I don't like about it from another intellectual standpoint is that it reinforces a bias that I think is pretty heavy through certain segments of the psychedelic community, that if it comes from nature, it's good, but if it's made in a lab, it's bad. And therefore, psilocybin, pure psilocybin, no good. But if psilocybin mushrooms are good, MDMA is bad, ketamine is bad, 5-MeO-DMT that's made in a lab is good if it comes from a toad. If it comes from a lab, it's bad. If it comes from a toad, it's good. With some people even saying that their spiritual or religious beliefs are that lab-made psychedelics are spiritually impotent and fundamentally ineffective, whereas the natural medicines are spiritual. I'm curious, as a psychotherapist, do you have an opinion, or do you have anything that you would want to comment along this natural versus synthetic divide that has in some ways become amplified in the modern psychedelic movement?
Well, I mean, with mushrooms, it seems like there probably are entourage effects that, there are alkaloids that are active that we haven't even studied yet. We don't know what they do. And that's been, I mean, if you look at, for example, the plant, green tea has caffeine. It also has L-theanine in it that balances the jittery intensity of the stimulant caffeine. So I think that plants are complex and have lots of different things going on that we don't really know what they are yet. But in terms of getting the job done with healing, I'm suspicious of anything that kind of like is all or nothing. Like, this is like this, and this is like this, and there's no overlap and no in between. Sounds a little bit like the amygdala talking to me, rather than the subtlety and the abstraction of the frontal lobe. Considering that most of what we talk about, we don't really know what we're talking about, but we're trying to have a conversation that's meaningful, even though the words that I use might not signal the thing to you that it means to me, and so on. So I think it's complex, but I think it's also a bit dogmatic to say that, one thing is good and one thing's bad. I think that there are drawbacks to the natural medicine kind of approach as you're describing it. Just want to add one more drawback, which is that there's a tendency to, I don't want to put this, there's a tendency to confuse what the opportunity is between, let's say, eating a mushroom and taking a hike in nature versus the opportunity of being in a one-on-one clinical psychotherapy session. And I think that's unfortunate, because I would like for most people to know that there are different opportunities in different settings, and that they're not the same, and that a more casual, recreational, or personal use of a psychedelic might have benefits, but they're not the same as when you have a skilled guide who's there for you and to protect your space and make sure that you get the result from the healing that you're looking for. So they're just different. They're different contexts, and they're not. It kind of bothers me when I hear, people talking about cannabis, for example, as which is in Colorado, you can buy it as a product in a store, and it's like, you might as well go to the liquor store and buy alcohol, or you can go to the cannabis store and buy cannabis. And again, it's something that can soften a symptom. I think that my understanding is there are people in the underground using psychedelic doses of cannabis for psychedelic healing sessions. I don't know much about that, but even with cannabis, there's sort of this misunderstanding, I think, about what the opportunity is. And so then what happens is the wholesale, reassignment of psychedelics into this sort of recreational bucket, and people don't realize there's another opportunity there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for your input on all of this today, Will. Just to remind the audience, we've been discussing many of the topics that arise within your new book with your co-author, Keith Kurlander. It is Psychedelic Therapy, a revolutionary approach to restoring your mental health and reclaiming your life, which will either just be coming out or will have just been released by the time this interview is made available to the public. So thank you so much for your time today, Will, and thank you to your publisher for sending me an advance copy of the book so I could give it a read in preparation for this interview, and I really appreciate everything that you've been able to share with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for taking the time to read through the book. It's been great being here with you.